started, please be aware that we do record all of our calls and put them on a YouTube playlist so that we have them. This is a public meeting, and we're also abiding by the CNCF Code of Conduct, so please be excellent to each other. I've tossed the notes URL in chat, and the date is January 18th, 2022. It's our second community meeting of the year. So let's start. I'm going to share my screen with the notes. How's everyone feeling today? Everyone's really motivated. I can tell. All right, here we go. All right, so welcome back. Quick CNCF status that I'd like to go over with. If you're not aware, we are in the CNCF sandbox area, applying for moving into the incubation phase of the project. The TOC meeting to discuss that is February 8th, which is when we'll be doing the application, and a lot of other projects will be there as well. So if you're into that kind of thing, holler at me and I can give you all the information if you're interested in sitting in those meetings, which is pretty cool. And the security assessment for the project is still going. I've added a link to that pull request there. I think the last time I checked, about an hour ago, Kapil, I think the ball's in our court to answer as far as the security of the Docker images.
Is that an update since when I replied this morning, or?
Yes. Yeah, if you want to check that out, that'd be great.
Sure.
In the meantime, we'll move on. Workshops are back. Umair wasn't able to make it today, but we have two workshops back to back here in January. January 25th will be the introduction to Cloud Custodian. We recommend this one for anyone who is just getting started with the project. And then Cloud Custodian 101, which is the day after on the 26th. And that's kind of the workshop where you have hands-on experience with the tool and that kind of stuff. And we have like examples for you to use and stuff. Liz, AJ, is this you or is this Jameson and AJ? Who's
I believe that one is Jameson and me.
Okay. All right. Any comments to add other than we hope to see you all there if you're interested?
Nope, that sounds like the right comment. Hope to see you there.
All right. Goals for the week, getting back from the holidays, that's still happening. We're going to go ahead and move on there to the PR and issue reviews. So normally I have an automated script that runs and it like broke over break. So I wasn't able to figure that out in time. So I've asked around and cherry picked some things for us to discuss. Before we do that though, does anybody, I do see some people on the call that I haven't seen before. If you want to say hello, welcome, first of all. And does anybody have any other agenda items that they don't see listed on here that they would like us to discuss? Does anybody want to say hello? All right, great. All right, first up, Kapil, AWS Cloud Control API. This is a major change, as I've heard you describe it before, but if you can kind of...
It's a new provider.
Yeah.
I think Pratush had flagged potentially looking at the Cloud Control API, and I think we had seen some stuff around it from both HashiCorp in the form of a brand new Terraform provider, as well as Pulumi in the form of not in their case of actually having their own provider instead of reusing the Terraform providers. So what is it? I think actually if you hit reload on that issue, if you go to the PR and then hit reload, there's no, sorry, not that one. The current one. There's a current PR. There's a different PR.
I've got the wrong one.
Yeah, if you that second one, yeah. So
yeah. Okay, I'll add that.
Has some expository text which sort of goes through the nature of this new provider. What's the value? What's the utility? Why are we doing it? Why is it a new provider? And the nutshell is basically understanding what Cloud Control actually is. It is effectively the latest version of Terraform engine, has a notion of a type registry associated to it, that type registry is extensible and also has some of the AWS native resources are available through it as well. Sorry, are open source as well as available through it. But basically, that type registry exposes, I would call a CRUDL, create, read, update, delete, and list API on the different resources. And Cloud Control effectively says, hey, why don't we just take all that type registry API that these plugins, that these resource implementations are using, and make them available through a separate API, independent of CloudFormation. And so this provider effectively exposes those directly as a new provider. The reason for doing a new provider is that they have very different attributes than what we would commonly see if we did a describe on it, on that resource through the native service APIs. And in many cases, it is just casing, but in many cases, there's a long legacy of CloudFormation versus the original service team's Bell specification. And in many cases, the attributes that we may potentially care about aren't necessarily exposed. So if you take a log group as an example of a resource that is available through both this cloud control provider as well as the AWS native provider and Custodian, you would see that stored bytes, for example, is not available as an attribute in cloud control. And so in doing that, I'd also highlight that the CRUDL implementation is non-uniform. Not all resources support list, for example. And some resources which purport to support update don't really do it in a usable way. Lambda functions as an example. At the same time, another couple other caveats it's worth highlighting. Some commonly used resources, say EC2, SNS, SQS, just to name a handful off the top of my head, are not available through this provider, just because of limitations in cloud control, where they can't do an actual list of those resources. But for all the resources that it is supporting or that are available through this provider, there is a generic update and delete action, and in general, where we support tags through this as well, universally. So every resource would have an update, a delete action, and tag filtering, and potentially tag modification as well. Some of this is dependent. In many ways, the cloud control is a trade-off between using a server-specific API and dealing with the idiosyncrasies of the service to a generic API, but non-uniform in how that actual API behaves. So now we're dealing with the idiosyncrasies of the CloudFormation type implementation that implements that API. And in many cases, those are not open source. It's probably like 40% are open source, or it might be even smaller than that. I'd said a slim majority, but there's maybe 800 AWS types exposed through the CloudFormation type registry, 400 of which are fully mutable. And of those, a smaller subset support the full API set that we need. Net, though, it's still a couple hundred resources, probably still like 200 resources. I just want to create awareness that this is mostly long-tail resources. So Nimble Studio. Did you even know AWS had a service called Nimble Studio? Well, they do, and this supports it. And so some additional things along those lines. So this is really helpful for just sort of filling out the full coverage on AWS to be inclusive of all the services that are out there. It's only been around for a few days, this particular provider. It does seem to work. I've got a few sample policies. I'm writing out some docs, trying to get it into our doc building stuff. One additional capability here is the schema for most of the resources is available within JSON schema. So starting to see if we can expose that out directly in the documentation as well as attributes to the resource. Potentially, we can do some additional work around validation of like value filters to make sure that they're actually targeting a real attribute on the resource, just for improving authoring experience. There's still some caveats here, specifically around child resources that we still need to work through, both in terms of matching up to event-based execution modes, as well as just being able to natively expose child resources are those that only exist if you pass like a parent ID alongside of them. So just trying to make sure that this is actually usable out of the box. I'm currently considering this provider alpha. Unlike the other providers where we have to re-implement all outputs and log syncs and blob stores, this will just piggyback on the existing AWS providers for those outputs. So everything else is roughly the same. Look to the questions, but
is there any value add to this provider as compared to the regular photo APIs?
That is a good question. Is there a value add? Not exactly. So if we have an existing AWS provider and it does something useful for you, then that is probably your best bet. This provider will do additional API calls for the resources based on how the underlying internal implementation of the provider is. And as I noted, in several cases, we don't actually have full awareness of what that actually looks like. But typically, there will be additional API calls involved for the implementation of the provider based on the type of registry implementation. So I would say it's mostly for supplemental resources versus existing resources that I would target it if you, for example, MemoryDB is supported through this. So, but it's not supported natively in the Cloud Custodian provider. So if you wanted to utilize MemoryDB and do governance policies on that, it would be worth looking at this provider for. But if you have a Lambda policy, instead of Lambda policies, for example, you would be better off using the existing Lambda resource implementation. But the commonality of Custodian schema validation, caching, outputs will be the same between both providers. It's really just a resource differential. But as an example, for even for like reads and gets and lists, in many cases, the CFN type registry implementation will do additional API calls, even if you, as a policy author, weren't interested in those attributes. And so that can result in additional load on the account. So, we also generate, like the same way that we do for AWS and GCP, these are also metadata. There's also metadata on all the resources as well as their actions to also annotate what permissions they need, which is a direct correlation to what API calls are doing.
Got it. Thanks.
Anybody else have questions?
By the way, it might be worth taking 2 seconds to talk about the implementation of the provider itself. If you look at that diff count, it says 92,000 plus lines. Most of that is JSON. Actually, like 400 of the files there are JSON, and there's maybe 6 Python files. Those are directly pulled from CloudFormation type information, and we'll just update those out of band as like a background nightly thing. And so those are mostly immaterial to the code change itself that's engaged, that's correlated here.
I've got a question, Kapil. What happens if those JSON files get out of date? If, say, the CloudFormation internal files have changed, Custodian still using an older copy, what's the impact?
Nothing per se. The impact is So mostly CloudFormation is supplemental, and so this is the underlying. The JSON schema here is related to its schema definition. So as a result, they've got a bunch of compatibility constraints associated to them. So the typically changes are supplemental for compatible via addition of attributes. So it's not per se problematic. It would effectively be you wouldn't necessarily be able to address the new attribute till there was a new release of the provider with the updated files. And as I said, we also intend to auto background it, so we're not directly having to maintain it ourselves.
Cool. Thank you.
Any other questions? Kapil, any final thoughts before we move on to AJ's section?
I actually had one other topic I wanted to talk about, which I don't know if we got into this list, but there has this is regarding a new metric provider output. There are a couple of issues regarding things like look at Prometheus or support my favorite metric sync as that are out there. And I've also previously heard from some larger users with regards to that are collecting metrics on every policy that the sum total of all those metrics can actually become expensive. And so one thing we're looking at is actually adding stats D support as a metric sync into that'll be available generically across the different providers. So if you have a local stats D and aggregation point, then we'll flag it and we will try to support the additional metadata. This stats D is not a standard per se. It's a de facto standard that every implementation has chosen to do a few things a little bit differently. But at least vis-a-vis, it's still simple enough for us to implement without entailing additional dependencies. That it will be a relatively straightforward lift. Just by way of alternative that was considered was looking at OpenTelemetry. OpenTelemetry, as I've gone through it, OpenTelemetry is a CNCF standard and implementation that has seen some uptick in the industry, but involves effectively a set of SDKs that are in direction that typically end up requiring as well an additional routing broker daemon, and it's also involved into a set of competing distributions of the same. And so all of that at a minimum would entail multiple megabytes of additional dependencies versus just doing a single module for stats-D support. And vis-a-vis OpenTelemetry also entails integration of traces as well as metrics, and I think they're starting to look at logs. We already have native log integration to the different provider backend stores as well as metrics, et cetera. So it's not clear that it's for something that's net new starting off, that might be the right lift for us, given we already have the native provider integrations. We're probably not going to go after that.
And I wasn't able to find an open. Is there an open issue or PR for this? Because I wasn't able to find it other than like the OpenTelemetry.
No, I was just happening upon some some nicer stats-D client implementations that were relatively small. So it's on me to go file an issue and try to tag all the related issues to it.
Okay, and if you're listening to it, hopefully the notes will have that issue in the notes by the time you get to it. All right. Anything else, Kapil?
That's it.
Starting off 2022 with a nice fat list of stuff to do. 19,000 lines. AJ, you're up next. You've got two cool things that we ran into over the weekend.
Yeah. So this one, where this started was moving. I don't know who else is running, doing some local contributions, running tests locally. I'd been using Tox, And I know at some point Kapil had switched over to using Poetry to both install the dependencies and run the test with make install Poetry and make test Poetry. So I started migrating some of my local tests over to using that. And because of some of my AWS CLI and Git config options, I had some tests break. And so just made what was theoretically a fix. and the fix worked for the AWS CLI bits. That was just unsetting an environment variable. But with the Git side, it was dying because of a non-default initial branch. This is with a lot of Git support moving over to use main rather than master, and that sort of thing. So the policy stream tests were all implicitly using master as the default branch to try to move that stuff over, and it all worked locally. It worked in CI, but then with Docker, with some of the older Docker images, it had an older version of Git that didn't support the initial branch option to the git init command, so it just died. And there looks like Kapil just bumped the image version. We're using a newer Ubuntu container, a newer Ubuntu image that has a newer version of Git, and so we don't run into that issue. Things just kind of work. But I guess the meta issue around that is I don't know if other folks have started using Poetry for when they're doing any sort of local installation testing, or if there have been any other issues that have come up related to that. Aside from these couple things, it's been pretty smooth and happy on my side. So just worth calling that out in general, that the move to Poetry has been pretty nice. Do you have something there, Kapil?
Something to say? Yeah.
Yeah. You actually recently, this is effectively support for non-master branches or default main branch, at least with regards to the project, Custodian repo itself. I have tried this out in a couple of other repos, this conversion process. It's mostly painless, except for people with existing checkouts, in which case, when they go to the project page, there will be an instruction that they can copy and paste. It does require them a little bit of manual, but it will preserve all the existing PRs. It's just that anyone's got a checkout that wants to keep track of the latest will need to effectively execute something manually, and that will affect several thousand forks.
Yeah, I think Appeal, like, if
Nice.
when you plan to flip the switch, give us a heads up, and I think we can definitely like give people a heads up on the mailing list, that kind of thing.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
I guess related thing that I didn't raise for Policy Stream, but I'm wondering, it looked like Policy Stream, if you don't provide a branch name, so just quick context on Policy Stream, it's one of the Custodian tools that you can use to see changes in policies across different Git commits in your policy repo. And if you're running a Policy Stream diff command, it'll show changes from one commit to another, and you don't give it a target revision, it will just assume master. And I don't know if it's worth adding any intelligence to that to look for other possible branches.
That's a good question. At the very least, it's worth documenting what that should look like. There is a way to interrogate it, I believe, but I'm not entirely clear if we want to do the extra fork. I'll defer to Tim, who's got his hand raised.
Tim?
In my use of it, at least, I thought it just used, if you didn't specify a branch, it used the default branch that was there. I'm not sure. I don't recall seeing that explicitly declared master. Is it actually saying master, or is it just using the default branch of the checkout?
The tests were doing a master, I think, or I don't know, actually.
Yeah, there was, if you don't give it a target, it does, there are a couple, well, you know what, we can, I will link to a section of code, and maybe it doesn't.
that's okay.
As far as interrogating it, I mean, we can certainly look through the Git config to see what the default branch is, but then that doesn't affect what we're already using.
I think it's maybe it's the way in which we're using Policy Stream differently to the actual CLI. We're sort of hooking in at a different level, so maybe we're
so I mean,
Policy
Stream has a bunch of different stuff in it. It does want you to specify like a source, and if you don't specify a source, I think it will try to do some inference to like master. Actually, yeah, it does. It will point to master or like head like up one rev. So there are one or two hard-coded references in there which are overridable via command line flags.
While we're talking about policy stream, what is the desire to tweak its algorithm for looking at history between two revisions? The default implementation, well, the current upstream implementation, at least last time I looked, was entirely time-based, which is fine if you have a linear squash history. But if you don't have a linear squash history, you're going to potentially miss commits.
So for the sorting between repos, I believe we do a topological, or we do one of the libgit sorting algorithms. I have to admit that, like off the top of my head, I'd have to go look at it before I could actually speak to it intelligently. It's not a code.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it looks like we do the topo sort versus sort time.
Yeah, the topological sort is weird.
Yes. And so you can, on the command line, you can, I think we default to reverse but reverse time bit, but you can pass that in explicitly as well.
Yeah. Okay. I was just thinking that I sort of overrode the implementation to actually do a complete DAG search of the historical previous revision, because if you say start from this rev ID and then move forwards, the topological sort doesn't guarantee to grab all of the history correctly. I guess it just comes from my my history playing with revision control systems and knowing that, you know, if you've got you got your graph of revisions and you say start from this revision and you have a topological sort, it doesn't actually guarantee that if you had an earlier commit that was not merged in until a later time on the branch, it was I think it skipped it.
Yeah, I mean, there's always trade-offs. That's why we expose both the algorithms both the available algorithms are exposed for that purpose.
Yeah.
But like we default to one just to, reverse time is a very intuitive thing.
I think
the other one there is that option.
Yeah, I think a lot of people also tend to squish history a lot. It's much more of a practice in Git to basically keep a nice main line.
Yes, for those that are used to history preserving version control systems, this is not as it is maybe a little bit strange, but it is a very common behavior. I think in Git.
How bizarre! Speaking of Tim, you're up next with your 3 ideas.
Yeah, so I think we had it sort of.
Do you want to go in order?
Up a few
how
things.
do you want to?
Yeah, I'm just gonna. Yeah, I'll just go from the top. So about a year ago, I sort of was talking with Kapil about how could I contribute to Custodian and looking at things. And one of the things we were looking at, prior to making a Custodian 1.0, we needed a way to deprecate some older ways of doing things. Because Custodian has grown over time as things were introduced or complexity changed, there was a very strong desire to keep backward compatibility for everything. We didn't want to break any of the existing users. So even though new ways were introduced, the old ways were still allowed. So a way to sort of mark things as deprecated got merged in a number of versions back. But we've not aggressively gone through the code base actually marking things as deprecated with the intent of having a potential break moving forwards. I'm not sure what the desire is around a 1.0, or whether or not we're going to say we're actually going to break some backward compatibility and actually remove some of the old deprecated things, but at least being able to raise awareness through the C7N validate command that you are using an old way of doing something, and being able to move to a new way. So I think one of the things that I found as I was going through the code base was just terminologies to like whitelists and blacklists in a number of different filters or actions. And so this PR is just saying we should deprecate that terminology and use allow and deny. It tends to be more clear about the intent of what you're referring to. So that's what this PR is, or this issue.
Yep, and I think there was also, I think we had chatted potentially about having some sort of tool that potentially could do some of the simpler transformations for people as an upgrade type of step. Although maybe that's the other one.
That's another one. Yeah. So I created just a few issues from the discussion point. One was about just changing deprecating whitelist and blacklist. I think there was another one. One of the other issues that I raised was actually about creating a simple tool that we can have in there that can do some of the automated conversion for you. Clearly, it's the last one you look at, George.
Yes.
Always. Yeah. So this one was like based on the idea of having some deprecation warnings. It's like, well, okay, if we know that there's a subset of things that we want people to easily be able to move from one way to another, we could have a simple tool that would just automatically update the policies to say, here, this is the old way, here's the new way. And we could then automate that for some people. So what I'm trying to do is see if I can get some dedicated work time to actually develop on upstream Custodian.
And that leaves the middle.
This issue is not per se viable outside of evaluating conditions.
This issue?
Yes, because region.
Yeah, I wasn't sure how easy it was.
And it's also related to use as a library, which we explicitly don't support. So
the question is, I know Custodian at the moment is very much desired around as a CLI tool and isn't used as a library. Are we wanting to add the functionality so it can be used more as a library, or what was the level of?
I mean, the reality is that we would need to define a public interface. We do not have one.
And then it becomes awkward.
Yeah, although because right now we can't just say everything that's internal right now says something public, because then we can't actually change it or fix anything. Like we want to actually, like I have a long-term desire of extracting out C7N core from C7N, which is currently C7N AWS really, just so that the other providers, like if I'm on GCP, I don't have to install Bodo and SDKs that I don't care about. And so that's part of what creates some of this awkwardness.
It's funny you keep talking about pulling out C7N core, but I can't help but want to have C7N-AWS instead of C7N-core, because then it fits with the GCP and Azure.
I hear you, but the reality is what's going to be the least amount of disruption.
What will actually work? Yeah.
What actually doesn't hurt people?
And
unfortunately, changing out C7N to be non-functional by itself would effectively damage a lot of installations.
Right. Actually, that makes more sense now that I think about it like that.
All right. Just those three, Tim?
Yes. I think there's I guess the other thing I'd just like to say, if we've got people that are here listening, I'm not sure how many people actually run the C7N validator over their policies, but with the introduction of the deprecation warnings, when you run the validator now, it will actually let you know if you're using any of the things that are marked as deprecated. We talked about for the deprecation warnings. We talked about having like an optional end date with the intent of saying this field is deprecated and we intend to remove it on this date. None of the ones that we've added deprecation warnings to have actually put a date on it with the intent of this is the date we're actually going to remove it. But with the deprecation, there was an extra flag added to the validator where you could say strict. And what it would do is the validation would then fail if you were using deprecated things as opposed to just warning you. So I think if you are using validation as part of your CI of your policies, potentially look at adding in the strict flag to the validator, and that would help you make sure you are moving off things that were deprecated. That was the only real addition at this stage.
I hope I captured that in the notes right.
Yeah, it looks good. Yeah, so it's more that I guess it's the C7N validate command, which is I think it's part of the core package, isn't it, Kapil? The validate. It's not a plugin.
Is that it? Just C7 and dash
Yep.
validate?
Yeah,
I think so.
it's in the core. It's been there for a year.
Yeah.
Well, maybe like 6 months at least.
Hmm.
As far as the actual merge and release.
Yeah. Okay.
With regards to deprecation time, I think that was also, I think we had punted that, so we actually defined what our actual deprecation schedule would be for any given thing. I mean, it's the start of a new year. And I'm definitely open to feedback on. I think we would need to actually put together an issue, but I'd be open to like something like 9 months. With regards to starting to actually start deprecating things, and
you mean actually removing the deprecated things?
As far as like we'll start to actually publish that as part of the deprecation warning, and then this will stop working in this date, and then whatever the release is after that date, we'll effectively strip it at that point.
What happens now, if you don't mind me asking? Like
right now, right now, the things that are marked deprecated work indefinitely. But
does it spew stuff to the console that says deprecated or anything?
Only on the validation of the policy.
Got you.
At this stage, I mean, we could theoretically, also add it out during execution, but a lot of the executions happen in an automated or scripted way, so you wouldn't see them most of the time.
Sure. Any other questions on this? All right. So how are you going to do this, Tim? When you get some time, you're gonna pick one and then give us a status report every few months? What's your vibe here?
I think what I would like to do, it might be interesting to see if I could write an automated tool initially, because there's the easy ones to tackle. I think would be like there's for some of the older tagging mechanisms, there were mark and unmark as well as tag and untag, and so it'd just be nice that would be a nice easy one to start with, and see if we could get the conversion tool working just with those. And then, so I think that would be an interesting PR to start with the de-deprecate tool. I'm not sure what we want to call it. Naming things is hard. Open to suggestions. But yeah, I think that would be a nice first approach, would be to take that.
All righty.
Uprecate?
Yeah, and with that, we've reached the end of the agenda. Does anybody have anyone think of something during the meeting they want to talk about, or any final comments before we give
Darren, you've got a couple of PRs up. Is there anything you wanted to flag or raise?
No. And just a quick intro. I joined a little bit late, but I'm Darren. I'm from Intuit. We're a big user of Cloud Custodian. And just a heads up, we're going to be contributing a lot of PR back to Cloud Custodian. In the past, we have been using the older version of Cloud Custodian where you guys support the plugin model, and we were having our own plugins of things. And now we migrate over to the latest version. So now we'll submitting back everything that we have customized.
Awesome.
And then of the PR that I've been submitting, Thank you, Kapil, for merging one of them. I think one has been approved. So I was just asking, what else is needed to, to merge, and then the other one was just some follow-up questions. Nothing urgent, but yeah,
That's
just
awesome.
nice to meet everyone.
Thank you.
Love,
Yeah.
love the contribution. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, and for those of you who are listening, just to explain how the meeting works is we usually have just an agenda. It's usually short, the stuff that's upcoming, and then we use the rest of the time to do things like we just did. If you need a long-winded, sorry, I didn't mean long-winded, Kapil. If you need a more bandwidth-rich experience of someone explaining something to you, you can bring your PR, and we just kind of work through it and that kind of stuff. That way you can come for the agenda. If you're not interested in the PRs, you could just bail in the meeting and then we sit there. We can also schedule other review meetings as well. So if you get to the point where you want to hop on a call or something and do that kind of high bandwidth discussion, we definitely will do that. So thank you. And with that, anything else? We're giving everyone 18 minutes back. It's a good one. The notes will be published to the Google group as usual, and the channel and the video will be on the YouTube channel probably by the end of the day. So with that, thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see everyone in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Cheers, George.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.